You a little bit of a snapshot of what is in the New York State budget. This may be a little bit hard to see, but essentially any budget has how much revenue do you come in, or how much money do you have, and how much money do you spend and on what. And so this is a snapshot of where the state raises revenue, right? So if you look, just over 50% of that is coming from personal income taxes. Business taxes makes up to around 10%, some sales tax in there. So these are the taxes that raise revenue for the state. And then you see on the other side, the expenditures. These are where dollars are going to be spent. It may not surprise you, or I hope it doesn't surprise you, that a vast majority of the dollars here are going towards education and healthcare, right? And so I think it's over 30%, yeah, 60% of the budget is going towards healthcare and education. It's a massive amount. And if you think about that in the context of what I'm about to share, it's really critical to know that despite all of the spending that you see here, we still have lots and lots of issues, right? I'm sure you all are speaking about them, whether it's at the city or the state level. And so this is a snapshot of what happens every year, but the reality is this. New York is one of the wealthiest states in the country. And yet, despite all that, our schools, public schools, continue to await $4 billion in court-ordered funding. I'm sure you've seen the issue in New York City, but this is not just a New York City issue. We have almost 100,000 people that are homeless in the state, and millions more lack stable, affordable housing. We already referenced the climate crisis. Healthcare system in New York, while in some ways is expanding, in some ways is beneficial to a lot of people, we also have major challenges, including an opioid epidemic. And candidly, each of these problems falls hardest on poor Black and brown people. And this is something that has not been addressed for a very, very long time. At the same time, we are home to the highest concentration of billionaires in the world. Guess how many billionaires we have in New York? Anyone want to guess?
130.
How many? 2, I heard?
23.
23?
100.
100? 50?
130.
130, okay, pretty close. We have 112 billionaires in New York, and their collective wealth is 3 times the state budget. So anyone a billionaire in the room, I should have asked in the beginning? Okay. Now, I've given this I've given this presentation probably 20-25 times now, and no one has raised their hand yet. So I guess the 112 have some other meeting spaces they go to. And look, the presentation is not to talk about, while success is bad or making money is bad.
We may have some future billionaires in here, right?
And hopefully those billionaires will be willing to give back.
Exactly.
And look, at the same time that I talked about those issues that were happening on the last page, our population of millionaires has grown really, really quickly. One thing you're going to hear a lot about when you get out into the streets and you get into your work is what is really driving people's inability to mobilize, right? What's holding people back from their ability to increase their own success? In New York, we have a property tax code which really places an ever greater burden on working people. And so you'll hear maybe from your parents, maybe from others that you work with, this idea that they're paying a lot of property tax for public schools or for other services. And part of the reason is the way the tax code is set up. And so the point of all this is to say, we clearly can agree we have some challenges we need to address. And we also clearly have a system that maybe isn't so equal, right? Maybe isn't really driving the type of equality we want. In fact, New York is the most inequitable state in the country. I have to say, I know a lot of New Yorkers that love being number one, but being number one in inequality is something I don't think anyone would ever be proud of. So, what's holding us back? Normally, when you think about advocating, you think about like, okay, I've got this policy bill that I want to support, that I want to get passed. And so bill number XYZ needs to get this many co-sponsors and this many people to support it publicly, and then it passes, right? You think about things like you hear a lot in the sort of presidential world right now, Medicare for All or Green New Deal. You think about these things as like things that just need to be passed. But in reality, what we're talking about is something that we need to confront together, which is more a worldview. Yes, we will have to pass policy, we will have to change the budget to make it more effective, but what we're really trying to confront is sort of weaponized constructs, if you will, things that have allowed us to live in a world where maybe we perceive things as normal when they're not. And so I think we can all agree we want to live in a fairer, cleaner, kinder, and more equitable New York. What's holding us back is a couple of things, in our opinion at least. This idea of austerity and scarcity. So if you think about the budget or the spending in the state as this idea of this fixed pool of money, and we can only spend so much, then at the end of the day, you're always going to have people fighting for different things. We work with a lot of advocates that go up to Albany every week and fight for healthcare, for housing, for all these things. At the end of the day, they end up with this tiny little pool to fight over for themselves. That's the idea of scarcity, right? So you only have so much to deal with. And then there's this idea that if you talk about taxing the rich or these progressive type policies, that somehow there's a radical left approach to things. Or even worse, you hear this thing all the time, and you're going to deal with this as you get more involved, that somehow the needs of the city are different than the needs of the rest of the state, and therefore it's just a bunch of city folks who are screaming for this. In reality, the things that unite us that I mentioned on that first slide are really issues that the entire state is facing. And we know we have a country that has been built on systemic racism that we have to confront. And so when you combine all of these things, it creates this idea that what we're describing as issues are just sort of fixed realities. We work with an amazing organization called Vocal New York. I strongly advise everyone to get to know their work. And Jawanza is one of their organizers who I always say, I like to say he's my friend. I hope he says the same about me. I've never asked, I probably should. But he said this quote one day, like just totally off the fly, and I've been using it everywhere because I find it so meaningful. He said, we need to stop perceiving these crises as fixed realities of our society. What that means is if you walk down the street and you see someone on the street homeless, and you walk past as if that's sort of a normal part of life, that means we should be challenging ourselves. Is that really okay? Is that really something that we should stand for as a society? And so you'll notice much of this has nothing to do with Democrat or Republican or left versus right or center. It has to do with what kind of a world we want to live in. And what the beauty of what we're advocating for is these are things that affect literally everyone. All right, so why the budget? I mentioned this a little bit already in the beginning. Why the budget? Because the budget controls just about everything. One thing, there's a lot of words on this slide, so I would advise you not necessarily to focus so much on that. But one thing I want to share, which is a little bit in the weeds, is how the budget gets decided is a big part of this problem. You probably know or could guess how the legislative process normally works. So the way the legislative process works is, let's say a state senator wants to introduce a bill. They introduce a bill to name a post office, which seems to be a favorite example of people in terms of how many things they do. Well, let's just do something really simple like that. Right, they introduce that bill, they get co-sponsors. Hopefully they have a bill also being introduced in the counterpart, which is the Assembly in New York State. And once they get enough co-sponsors, they vote on those bills. If it passes, it gets sent to the governor for signature, right? You probably have heard that type of process. It's the same thing in DC, right? The House may pass a bill, then the Senate has to pass the bill, and then it would go to the president for signature. So that's the normal legislative process. And what happens there is you have people weigh in publicly. There's public input, right? There's sometimes hearings. It's a really kind of open process, or at least it should be. With the budget, it's somehow the complete opposite. So the way this process unfolds is January, February timeframe, the governor introduces his proposal or her proposal if we end up having a woman governor.
Which we haven't.
What'd you say?
Which we have not.
Which we have not. And that then proposal becomes essentially the negotiating path for the rest of the legislature to weigh in. In other words, the legislature has a lot less power in the budget than they do in the normal legislative process. Mm-hmm. Any ideas on why that might be a bad thing? Any ideas are good ideas?
Guesses work.
Good.
Because the budget's directly related to the legislature, and they need to kind of separate it out based on what legislature they're hoping to implement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, really good point. Anything else?
Also, the legislature is more representative of the issues and the people in the community than the governor is necessarily, just because the governor is only one person.
Totally.
Then, yeah.
right? Both of those things are really the two critical issues. So one of the reasons the legislative process is the way it is, maybe not perfect, is because you want input from lots of different people, lots of different communities. When the budget, which is again, I would argue the single biggest piece of legislation that happens every year, is really being dictated mainly from the governor to start, and then the legislature has to negotiate kind of in a back room. It's not really a democratic process. So when we're talking to people, we're both making the case for what, the budget should be, but also that the process needs to change. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that, how we're tackling that in a couple slides. Any questions on that? Because I know it's a little bit in the weeds, but I do think it's important to realize. Cool. All right, so what does budget justice actually mean? And you can see this on the postcards I handed out. What we're essentially advocating for is taxing the vast, underassessed extreme wealth in our state to raise an estimated $35+ billion and investing it to make New York a better, fairer, safer home for us all. I should have mentioned at the beginning, the state's budget is $175 billion, more or less. So what we're talking